Hello, students. Time for another lecture. So let's get started here as I pull up my screen and start the slideshow. Today, assessing family functioning in diverse families and cultural contexts. So a very important chapter, given that the NASW Code of Ethics places a very high degree of importance and responsibility for us as social workers as it relates to cultural diversity and working across cultural boundaries. So when we think about social work practice with families, there's some things that come to mind that we really need to kind of pay attention to. And so it's about how family is actually defined. And you will see that there is no one single definition for family that fits everyone. So families can consist of um, actual family members that are related by blood. They can also be fictive kin, so there are other people that are a part of the family and treated as such, but have no blood relation or ties at all. So again, families can look any number of ways these particular days. So just understanding that old concept of the nuclear family of mom and dad and kids is expanded tremendously over the last several decades and years. So we're going to also look at family functioning because that's an important area of working with families, looking at the stressors, the normative stressors, the non-normative, looking at family work, resilience in families, as well as extraordinary life transitions and separations. So unexpected deaths, things of that particular nature. So all of those are things that we need to take into consideration when we're looking at working with families. So we also need to recognize and understand that in order to do a good job assessing family, there are a number of different instruments that we can actually utilize. And these instruments have been thoroughly researched over the years and actually have proven to be effective. And some of them are strength-based and some of them are also risk assessments. And we also need to make sure that as we are assessing family functioning, that we really understand and place a high degree of importance on the cultural differences that might exist within those particular families. So there's just a couple of, or here are a few tools that folks have used. One of two of these you've actually already used in your work in your generalist class, as well as HBSC, and that's a genogram and an ACO map. So it's a way for you as a social worker to get a pretty clear, accurate assessment of what's involved in a family, who are they connected to, what are the potential systems that could be of help for you, as well as recognizing those parts of the systems that are become barriers and challenges for our families. So when we think about these systems concepts, we have to think about family and homeostasis. So, and basically family and homeostasis is just like the homeostasis that we learned about in biology. And it's really about trying to maintain a constant state of balance so that we don't want things to tilt too far to the right or too far to the left. And one of the ways that we do that, maintain that balance, is through the interaction of family rules, and then also looking at these particular types of interactions. So when we think about family functioning, we think about, why do families exist? What are they here for? We all came out of families. We're all a part of a family, good, bad, or otherwise. And basically, families have some pretty significant functions in terms of what it is they are required to do, or what some of the major roles are. And one is about procreation. It's kind of about the perpetuation of the species. Also to provide for the physical needs of the family members, to secure attachment. So to make sure that people have relationships that are connected to other people in the family. The big job of socializing the children, getting them all work prepared here at home, and then sending them out into the world for them to come back different to us, for those of you who are parents. Regulating sexuality in terms of setting up clear and appropriate or boundaries for about sexual relationships, as well as satisfying emotional needs. So people need to be a part of those. So those are just basic family functions that families are tasked with. And so when we understand that piece, and then we start to look at things like rules that are designed to kind of help move some of those processes along. And then we have to really look at as a family functions, are these functional rules or rigid rules? Are there just absolute things that you cannot do? Is that all of the rules in the family, or does that apply to just some? Um, Cautions about assessing rules. So really for us to just really kind of be mindful as we're looking at exploring what these rules are, the violation, the flexibility, and then the mapping. Just really, these are going to be things that we will need to explore as social workers working with families to really understand this whole process about how the family maintains itself. As well as we'll need to pay attention to family interaction. So um, paying attention to how people connect with each other. Um, Looking at, if I'm in a family and we're having some conversation and dialogue because there are some issues that are going on, I'm going to be paying attention to how people interact. So I'm going to look at and pay attention to who speaks first, who then responds. I'm also going to be looking at things like facial expressions for those who are quiet in the room. I'm noticing who's not contributing. I'm noticing subsystems develop who kind of tag teams with the other person, maybe in opposition to the mom or the dad, whether they're actually a tight unit. So, and sometimes employing that circular questioning behavior is really important as well too, in terms of a way to kind of grasp some of the issues that might be happening inside of a family. So, you know, I might ask the 16-year-old who may have been identified as their behavior as a part of the problem and ask them what their particular view of what the problem is as it relates to the family. And then I will go around the room and I will ask everybody there that same particular question and really look at and pay attention to the differences that I might get in terms of the answer, because again, it's about how people interpret that whole process as well. So when we think about the dimensions of the family assessment, we've got to identify the things that are most important to your clients. We've got to guide the exploration of family behavior. So really kind of help people understand, we've been a family forever, and we've got certain behaviors that we involve ourselves in, and we never stop to think about why we do those, whether those are helpful for the overall progress of the family or whether they are to their detriment. So really exploring that with families to help them learn about what they do and whether it's a helpful thing or whether it's not a helpful thing. Um, also, gathering data in terms of the theme. So what am I seeing when I go out and I visit with you and we talk about these things? I look at relationships and interactional patterns, and I'm doing some observations. And then I'll write a profile based on all the things that I've seen over time, of the individuals, the behaviors of the individuals in the system. When we're together, John tends to play this particular role, or he does a lot of this. This particular person is unusually quiet. This person is overly vocal and openly hostile most of the time. So I'm looking at all of those particular dynamics, and then employ the dimensions to assess the relevant behaviors for the entire family. So I'm looking at them as individuals, how they function. I'm looking at them as a group, how they function. And then starting to really look at pulling out some of those problematic behaviors that are just a part of that system, so that we have something now to kind of focus on and look at. When we also look at the family, the continued family assessment, we're looking at things like the family form, the diversity within the groups, and immigration and refugee status. So when we think about the different families, and when we think about cultural, racial, ethnical, and religious diversity, all of those things have a very huge impact in terms of us understanding how we need to approach these families, given that they may have these different types of realities that is really kind of dictated by the culture in which they grew up, in terms of roles, in terms of responsibilities, any number of different things, as well as thinking about it from the standpoint of immigrant or refugee. So what if you lived a good portion of your life in another country with a whole different set of laws, rules, and social welfare expectations, and now you're in America and things are very, very different. So the adjustment to that particular kind of situation could also create some functioning issues for how do families fit and adjust in this new environment. We also need to, again, look at families in terms of the context of the diversity in which they bring. So Latino families are similar but different than African American families, that are similar and different than Asian families, that are similar and different than European families. So we need to be able to understand those dynamics in terms of how families see themselves and how they function. And so here's where a lot of research might be helpful in terms of as you're working with families that are different than you to get some background information before you go out to try to do the assessment so you can understand what it is you're actually looking at. Also, being able to explore family strengths. All families have some strengths, whether they acknowledge them or not. So it's your job to really help them see them in this particular assessment process as well too. And then also to really look at boundaries. What are the external boundaries? What are the internal boundaries inside of the family subsystem? Who connects with who? What are the rules, whether they're spoken or unspoken? Uh, how does culture impact that particular piece? For example, in African American culture, Southern African American culture, when I grew up as a kid, um, family, different members of the family had different roles. And so, for one of the things that I remember pretty clearly is that the elders in the family always had a significant role and were just due respect just based on who they were in the family. So, grandma, the other elders, the great aunts, the great uncles, grandpas, um, their presence just connoted that you, as a member of the family, responded in a different way to them. Um, Being disrespectful was just something that wasn't even an option or in terms of being tolerated. So again, and we had a lot of respect for our elders. So, you would see things like um, oftentimes as people got older in the African American community, the likelihood of them actually going to an assisted living or nursing home was probably pretty low because people wanted to make sure that they connected with and took care of their parents in their old age in their homes to the extent that that was possible. So there's just some cultural differences in terms of that, and different cultures have different views about how they see the elderly. Um, so disengaged families, families that don't really connect with each other, that don't really talk, that just kind of occupy the same space, but have these really intense emotions and behaviors around how they connect with each other, or in this instance, don't connect with each other. Family gets disengagement with external systems. And so, is my family closed off? Is it just kind of us in this house and then the rest of the world against us? And do we are we open to having friends come over? Do we have interactions and meaningful relationships with people in our neighborhoods? Those kind of things. The lack of that could actually be a sign of some other issues that might be happening in the context of that family. So really to assess all of those things in terms of what's happening in the family, what's happening outside of the family, what the boundaries are, what's rigid, how people connect, and so on and so forth. Also looking at the family power structure, elements of power within the family, how it's distributed, shifts in power. When we think about it through the lens of race and culture, and then assessing power, and then family decision-making process. So how do families make decisions? So in some cultures, the father is the absolute authority, and what they say works. In other cultures, there's more of a team approach in terms of that particular piece. Um, in some maybe single parent families, I've got only one parent. So if I'm a single headed household and it's a mom, then I'm taking on the role of mom and dad. And so if I'm parenting kids alone, that's going to have some different implications in terms of how power is actually shared. Or I might have a kid who is older who may be able to be more responsible to help take care of the younger sibling. So that might be some ways to share power. So being cognizant of all of those particular things, I think, are going to be very important for you as you start to really look at assessing this family and how they do things. And sometimes families, have been operating this way since the very beginning, so they don't know that a lot of times some of the behavior that they could be involved in just based on how they were introduced to things could be problematic in terms of how the family is functioning today. So just to keep those things in mind. Think about what the family's goals are. Being real clear, what do you need to happen, or what would you like to see be different as it relates to this particular family and how we all connect. Understanding the myths and the cognitive patterns, how people think about things, understanding those family roles, which can look very different based on what's happening within those families. And sometimes just the shifting in the roles could create any kind of functioning issues for families because, if I've got a 14-year-old who is now acting in the capacity of mom because let's say she has some significant mental health issues and she is addicted to chemicals. So that might shift how things work in the family in terms of those particular roles. So just to be mindful and cognizant of those kind of things as well too. Um, Communication styles, really, 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 as you know by now, for our social workers, communication is the window to a lot of different things. So really making sure that we understand uh, the congruence and the clarity of communications. How do people in families connect with each other? Paying attention to the nonverbals as well as the verbals, as well as the context are going to be very important pieces. Looking at those barriers to communication, those receiver skills, is the information that I'm sending out to the family being received? Am I, as the sender, sending things out in a way where it's not receivable or it is receivable? And then respond and acknowledge the strengths and the achievements and the growth. So again, as we work with families and we've identified problem issues, let's say around communication, and we put a plan together to really look at how we do that, then it's about monitoring the progress in terms of that, recognizing also these barriers that we have here in terms of these are the things that um, actually become barriers to communication. So if you think about when we did a section a little bit ago that talked about communication barriers in terms of interviewing processes, a lot of these are the same. But you're just looking at it from a meso perspective or from a family perspective in terms of really looking at how the family engages in type of this type of interaction, which could be a barrier or are barriers to how families communicate. Also, when you're doing that assessment piece, is to really understand the life cycle in terms of where this family is, because life cycles will dictate that certain things happen at certain times. And so, if I've got a young person who was unattached, then their family life situation will be different. When you marry someone or you become a couple, then things take on a different, because there are two people now that are actually involved in this relationship, and there has to be some shifting and changing of rules, roles, regulations, expectations in terms of the relationship. Then we introduce young kids, which adds another whole chapter to, like, okay, now we've got these little human beings who we have no clue about. They're cute, they're messy, but it's our job to kind of provide for them and raise them. And the only way we know how to do that is to simulate some of the things that we were taught when we were kids, kind of thing. Whether that's a good thing, whether that's a bad thing, kind of remains to be seen. And then as kids grow older, the needs for these kids changes and your relationships with them change. So the adolescent years, which most people dread, um, are times when the kids are trying to find their own source of independence, deciding who it is they are and who they want to be. And pretty much every facet of life in the relationships with their friends will be more significant oftentimes than the relationships that they have with you. And then launching children. So as children start to age out, they get college age, they get to look at military, moving out on their own, they finish school, um, or they haven't finished school, but it's time for them to kind of move on. So that becomes another aspect of, what does those family relationships looks like when people are no longer residing in your home? What if they live across the country? And then family in later life. So as parents get older, they have grandkids, they have other people who become a part of their family because their children may have connected with significant others and have started their own family. So those dynamics. And then we're also looking at things like sometimes declining health, looking at retirement, those kind of things. So those are all cycles. And so they give us a little bit of a hint about what might be happening when we enter to a family based on where they are in the life cycle. So that pretty much concludes our conversation about working with families. And so I would encourage you to kind of continue to do your readings, and then we will have some exercises that we'll follow through in class. And so also write down the questions that you might have that we need to review. I will see you in class.